you and for your reference. We also received a grant from the NIJ to study tactics used to deter sex buying. Going after sex buyers is really the only ultimate way to end prostitution and sex trafficking. On the legislation front, for example, NCOSE is actively engaged in getting the landmark federal legislation on human trafficking passed, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, or the TVPRA. There are efforts in this critical law right now to remove the accountability of sex buyers. Thankfully, thanks to our advocacy and our allies, so far that's remained in that piece of legislation. Additionally, there are efforts across the United States to decriminalize sex buying, pimping, and brothel keeping. The NCOSE and many of our allies are working to equip local leaders and educate legislators to oppose such drastic measures, which would only serve to explode the prostitution marketplace and thereby sex trafficking and all of its related harms. Just last night, there was a powerful hearing in Rhode Island where thankfully 2 bills were stalled from moving forward. On the litigation front, NCOSE has a law center embedded into our organization. We've filed a number of lawsuits, and we're seeing positive rulings. Specifically, we filed the first class action lawsuit against Pornhub for trafficking children on its site, and another against Twitter for allowing child sexual abuse material to remain on its site, enabling them to profit from the trafficking of 2 young boys. On the advocacy front, we're lobbying to get mainstream companies to stop partnering and profiting from sexual abuse and exploitation. We recently, with Tina Front here, we moved Instagram to roll out features stopping adults from sending private messages to children on its platform, which is really a main way that a number of kids are being groomed. We're also advocating right now with Google that they remove image-based sexual abuse right away when survivors request it. We're very hopeful that they'll make a big announcement soon. On the training front, we are happy to host events like this, where key leaders and advocates can learn and strategize together. We also train parents in schools, and we have a new curriculum for law enforcement on tactics to target sex buyers. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about ourselves, and I thank you for being here. And I want to turn it over now to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Stephanie Powell. Dr. Powell serves as the Director of Law Enforcement and Survivor Services here at NCOSE. She's had a distinguished career serving the LAPD for 30 years, ending her career as captain of the Vice Squad. And following the LAPD, she served as Executive Director of the Direct Services organization Journey Out. And now we're extremely grateful to have Dr. Powell's voice here at this national level.
So hello everyone, I'm your moderator today, and I hope I do an outstanding job so that I'll have a job tomorrow and You know, I just want to applaud Dawn as well because of her collaborative effort as we go into this fight of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Those of you that are EDs of nonprofits, you know sometimes we don't do things collaboratively because they only give us $2 and then we have to separate it between, share between 20 organizations. Right. So yeah. I just have to applaud her efforts, and it's because of her efforts that we are here today. I just want to share a little bit with you guys. I received a text this morning as a result of California Senate Bill 1042 that did not pass. And had it have passed, it would have classified human trafficking as a strike felony, a serious and violent crime. And this is what the text read. It says, I think there is a disconnect when it comes to human dignity. And I thought about that as I was coming here from Vermont, which that's a whole nother story because I'm from LA. And trying to get a taxi to the airport, you know, from Petticoat Junction was a little, for those of you that are old know what I'm talking about. It made it a little difficult, but I made it. So as I was waiting to get a taxi to take me to the airport that didn't show up, I was thinking about the text, and I was thinking about human dignity, and I was thinking about my day yesterday when I was when I was teaching this law enforcement agency about how to have a more trauma-informed approach when interviewing victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. And it was there that I learned that in Vermont, you will go to jail for shooting a wild turkey out of season. But in that same state, laws pertaining to buying people for the purposes of commercial sex are not heavily enforced. And Vermont is not the only state. So I looked up the term human dignity, and I found the most amazing phrase that said that human dignity justifies human rights. You see, when people are divided and given a value based on characteristics such as class, gender, race, it creates an unequal society where it will allow discrimination to run rampant. People are then assigned to a higher value, which then throws us into a situation where we are fighting legislative policies that should be designed to support the right to exit a system that is inherently violent and that disproportionately affects women and girls of color. And then also the thought that we need to accept those as they're coming back into society and walk alongside them so that they can be the best that they can be. Why are we fighting legislative policies that would allow people to buy and exploit others? What about the human rights and dignity of those being sold and victimized? We need to understand that demand is the root cause of the suffering bestowed upon the exploited. That full decriminalization of prostitution does not solve the problem of poverty. What it does is it allows demand to create more harm. You see, history has taught us that what happens in places where human dignity is not seen as an inherent human right will then allow legislation to harm others. So therefore, we must be careful that if society fails to recognize human dignity in our public decisions, we then will allow a cycle of abuse and traumatization to continue. What we need to do is to listen to the survivors. The concept of last girl first is based on Gandhi's philosophy, which recommended that we always think of the last person when making a public decision. As an African American woman that was a little girl growing up in the 50s and 60s, I know what it's like to not be seen. I know what it's like to be invisible. But what I do know is that organizations such as the National Center on Sexual Exploitation and CAP International, what I know is that they see me. CAP International speaks truth to power, and it's through their research study, and because of their studies, that it allows the world to see me, to know that I'm here. And with that, we are going to open our event today. So, I want to first introduce to the podium Ingrid Ask, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Sweden.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Dr. Powell, for that introduction and those very powerful words that you gave us to begin with for all of us. And it's really a pleasure to be here today. It's a very important and unfortunately always, but also now a very timely event. And really, I want to thank the whole CAP International team for putting together this report, Last Girl First. I think it's really putting the headlight on how the most marginalized and also vulnerable communities are also overrepresented when it comes to sexual exploitation and prostitution. But not only that, also what we can do about it. And I think that is perhaps the most important part in terms of giving us ideas of how to work together to do something about this virtual hours. Exploitation in prostitution and human trafficking for sexual purposes is a ruthless and cynical crime, even so as it tends to target, again, the groups, as I said, that are the most vulnerable and shown in this report. And I think, we said this is an untimely event. Of all the horrors that we read about daily nowadays in the newspapers, resulting from Russia's unprovoked and unjust aggression towards Ukraine, I think that one of the things that have at least hit me the hardest from all that we're seeing are the warnings by the United Nations that Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and children, can see that they are now being targeted by human traffickers. This is horrendous, and I fear that we will see more of that. Offers of fake jobs, phony travel arrangements with the purpose to further exploit in the worst possible way fellow human beings already reeling from pain and catastrophe. This is what we're seeing. And it's hard to even comment on such heartless cruelty, but let's just say that if there was ever a need for further urgency in combating human trafficking, we have it now in our own countries also. Sweden was the first country in the world to criminalize the purchase, but not the sale, of sexual services. This model that we took on, targeting the demand side of prostitution, reflects our conviction that people in prostitution are fundamentally victims, whereas buyers of sex seek to exploit their vulnerable situation. And this new type of demand-focused law came into force in Sweden in 1999, 22 years ago, and it has been an important tool to counteract trafficking in persons for the purpose of sexual exploitation. It has strengthened the victim's position, and it has made Sweden, we can see that, a less attractive market for traffickers and procurers of prostitution. And the law also has strong support with the Swedish population. Clear majority of Swedes support this law. Trading in sex is about people, but it's also about power structures. Sweden pursues a feminist foreign policy, actually a feminist government policy, not only foreign policy. But we have also, this includes prostitution and trafficking in human beings as being seen as, for sexual exploitation, is a highly gendered issue. And men are predominant purchasers of sexual services from women, girls, LGBTI people, men and boys also. And most people in prostitution are women. By exclusively targeting the demand, Sweden aims at both disrupting the market and addressing an inherent power imbalance between men and women. And the criminalization of sex purchase contributes to changing social norms and attitudes also, which is equally important. Paying another person for sex is something that is being seen as socially unacceptable. And this principle should be echoed in the comprehensive sexual education curriculum, which dedicating the messaging for boys and young men, aimed at changing harmful gender norms that justify violence and restriction of women's and girls' choices related to sexuality and reproduction. So in Sweden, CSE, Comprehensive Sexual Education, in schools have been updated to equip boys and girls with an understanding that sex must be based on consent and free will. We have also introduced a new sexual offences legislation based on consent. So in relation to trafficking, the legislation means that anyone who pays for sex with a person who has been trafficked can be convicted of rape. Finally, bans on prostitution need to be complemented by social efforts, of course. People in prostitution need exit strategies, they need support, alternative livelihood opportunities, and to be successful, we must listen to the voices of victims and survivors and include them in the efforts ahead. So, moving forward, but I'm heartened to be part of this strong coalition here today. All of you and your organizations have important work that you do here and elsewhere in the world. We all need to do more to address the crime of trafficking in persons, and I know that by working together, we can make our individual efforts more than the sum of the parts. And we are not alone, of course. In the years since 1999, several other countries have implemented prostitution laws targeting demand in a similar way as ourselves. We have Norway, Iceland, Ireland, Canada, Israel, France, and others. And what was first referred to as the Swedish model is now being referred to as the equality model, which is something that we welcome. We especially welcome the active engagement on this issue by France, with whom we have a joint diplomatic strategy to address global trafficking for sexual exploitation. And France, as you can see, is also co-sponsor to this event, and I will soon welcome my colleague, Frédéric Chollet, to take the stage. And to conclude and to sum up, prostitution and human trafficking are unacceptable crimes. Sweden believes that targeting the demand is the most effective way to stop perpetrators and to change harmful norms, while at the same time respecting and helping victims. So I very much look forward to being here today and to listening to the rest of the presentation and the following discussion. Thank you once again, and I'm happy to welcome to the stage Frédéric. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Ingrid, for your introduction and remarks. And thank you for inviting me to this event. I want to offer my special thanks to the National Center on Sexual Exploitation for hosting this event, to the Swedish Embassy, of course, and other sponsors, and to CAP International, which contributed to its organization. CAP International has helped organize similar events in many other US cities, and I know that it does a great job in combating human trafficking. You have France support, Sweden support, and certainly the support of many of us who are here today. France and Sweden are proud to have decided in March 2019, as we mentioned it, Ingrid, to develop a joint strategy to combat human trafficking for sexual purposes in Europe and in the world. Human trafficking is a serious human rights violation, and women and girls make up the majority of the identified victims. The total number of victims is still rising as a result of irregular immigration and forced displacement due in particular to armed conflicts, persecutions, and human rights violations, as we are seeing in Ukraine, of course, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, and many other countries that are at war or even not at war. Conflicts, the lack of economic opportunity, discrimination, and sexist and sexual violence further expose already vulnerable people to abuses. The deterioration of the rule of law allows many human traffickers to act with total impunity. The statistics are well known, but I want to remind you of two of them. 80% of trafficking victims are women and children, and 60% of trafficking is for the purpose of sexual exploitation. France and Sweden have clearly opposed the normalization of prostitution as work. In our opinion, prostitution always exploits a person's vulnerability and should therefore never be considered a regular job. France, Sweden, and several other countries, we have to convince more countries to join, have adopted laws penalizing the purchase of sexual acts, but not the act of prostitution itself. This type of legislation, which targets the purchasers of sexual acts, has proven effective. The results in Sweden, where this law has existed for more than 20 years now, are very positive. On the national level, France adopted a law in 2016 to step up the fight against the system of prostitution and to provide support to prostitutes. This law prohibits the purchase of sexual acts. France adopted a second national action plan to combat human trafficking based on three priorities. First, raising public awareness of the issue of human trafficking. Secondly, improving care for victims. And third, accelerating the dismantlement of criminal networks. To abolish human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, three key actions must be taken. First, there must be a zero tolerance policy to end the impunity that the perpetrators of sexual violence and gender-based violence still enjoy. That is why, together with Sweden, France is promoting an abolitionist model of prostitution. Second, victims must be fully brought into the decision-making process. That is what we currently do with the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the UN Security Council. Bringing victims into the decision-making process is crucial. It is an empowerment measure, and civil society has a key role to play here. Third is the fight against inequality, and in particular the inequality between men and women. Every country in the world has agreed to do everything in their power to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Our two countries are convinced that prohibiting the purchase of sexual acts would be a major step toward achieving those goals. Today's event, in particular the panel discussion that will follow, is one more step forward in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Now we're going to bring up to the podium Hada Jafour from CAFA, Lebanon CAF International. How did I do? I didn't get a tutorial.
It's really good. Actually, it's really good compared to others.
Okay. I appreciate you because I had to have a whole tutorial.
Thank you, Dr. Farooq.
You're welcome.
So my name is Hada Jafour. From
That's what I said.
From CAFA organization in Lebanon. CAFA is a feminist organization working on violence against women and on issues related to prostitution and trafficking. And we're a member of CAF International. Good afternoon, distinguished guests. On behalf of CAF International, I'd like to welcome you all and thank NCOSE for hosting this event. I am very delighted to introduce the report Last Girl first. And introduce CAF a little bit. CAF International works with the last girl and for the last girl to become first. The coalition, whose sole aim is to end sexual exploitation and prostitution, groups 35 frontline organizations across 6 continents and has, over the years, provided services to more than 16,000 persons and women in particular, victims of prostitution. The objective of this report is to give a voice to the last girl, who is always made invisible, like Dr. Farooq said. Across the world and throughout history, women and girls from the most discriminated, marginalized, and impoverished communities are largely present in the sex trade. These are the last girls that need to be put first. A Syrian woman refugee in Lebanon told me once, "I spread my legs to feed my children." This simple but poignant statement is applicable to many, many prostituted women in the four corners of the planet. From refugees in Lebanon to Ukrainian women who are at high risk of being recruited by pimps and traffickers waiting for them across the border. This statement reflects as well the situation of prostituted women among internally displaced groups in Colombia, Dalit castes in India and Nepal, indigenous women in Canada, the US, and New Zealand, to name a few. This is also true to migrant women in the mega brothels of Germany and the mega brothels of in Belgium, who 3 weeks ago further decriminalized pimping and brothel management. And the list is long. The Last Girl First report depicts the prostitution trends in 50 countries and dives into vulnerabilities and inequalities that drive women and girls into prostitution and keep them there, namely poverty, homelessness, discrimination, and the broken past filled of violence and assault. The report also deconstructs the systems of prostitution at the root of the sex trade, be it patriarchy, racism, colonialism, and capitalism. And in the background of these systems are, of course, the sex buyers, the men who, without their entitlement, money, and power of purchase, no woman and girl will be sold or bought. The Last Girl First report is a great advocacy tool that can be used by any organization in any country to build a survivor movement, to educate, and to push for abolition and protection of victims. We know that abolishing prostitution, offering real alternatives to prostituted persons, and going after sex buyers, traffickers, and pimps is neither easy nor fashionable. Not only it entails dismantling a very lucrative industry, it requires standing against those very systems of oppression that allow men paid access to women's bodies. It requires a change in the norms and narratives. It requires, for instance, standing up firmly against the hypocrisy of certain UN agencies and international organizations and donors whose mandate is to promote equality between men and women and who have a great influence on the policies and laws in many countries in the global south. These agencies and donors are drifting intentionally from the agreed UN language and principles of prostitution and are promoting it as decent work and as sex between two consenting adults while calling for decriminalizing it. They turn a blind eye on the fact that the international law sees prostitution as incompatible with the human value and dignity. They also ignore that governments have the obligation to criminalize the exploitation of the prostitution of others and reduce the demand. They ignore the basic definitions of violence against women and equality, the massive amount of research and survivors' testimony that show the multidimensional harm of prostitution. And they overlook the positive results that Sweden and France, for instance, have already achieved. Abolition is the only way to go, and this is our motto at CAP. It is the only way to go in order to end the system of prostitution. Abolition is not only the liberation of prostituted persons from sexual exploitation, but also the liberation of all women. This is because equality between men and women cannot be conceived, let alone achieved, if half of this planet can potentially buy the other half, either physically or virtually. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hear Emma, Jonathan, and the survivors' testimony today.
Thank you so very much. Now it is my honor to introduce to you Tina Front, who is the founder of Courtney's House. And she will be speaking to us today on the sexual exploitation that is happening here in our nation's capital.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Because that mic isn't working?
Yes.
I can turn my mic up. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Tina Front. I'm the executive director and founder of Courtney's House, based here in Washington, D.C. Courtney's House is the only survivor-run, only African-American run, direct services that work with sex-trafficked youth in a DMV area. So I'm a survivor of child sex trafficking. And, you know, Courtney's House was started basically everything that I did not receive. So that means a few things that we do differently. When you hear the word Courtney's House, we are a drop-in center. Who knows what drop-in center is? Okay. Right, what is it? Oh, you didn't know you was part of it. Everybody like, no, for real though, what is it?
It's a place where survivors can stop in and get various needs met, and hopefully get connections to other longer term resources.
Yes, so what she said was that it's like a place where you can drop in and you get services. So yes, with a twist, because I like to take words and change them to what I think it should be. So that means a few things to me. And so that means that, yes, it's a drop-in center, but we're in an actual house. So it always should be an actual house to me. What youth? And I work with ages 9 now to 24. So what youth will want to hang out at a drop-in center in your office?
Right.
Right, like nobody is not fun. You know it's not fun when you go to work every day. So with that being said, we wanted to have a space, but we work with boys and girls. And I want to talk about that because most of our boys do not define as LGBTQ. They don't. And it's actually most of the girls that do. And most of our boys defined as straight. So I want to talk about our population because really, thank you to CAP International for their research, because I want to kind of expand that on what's happening, particularly in DC. So thank you for that, because your information was no cap. Yeah, that was for the younger population. So let's talk about that, and I think people's reality of what's happening in DC. So Courtney's House has the only contract actually in the country with foster care in this way. And I say it's a contract because most people have grants. And to get a contract, you have to beg a lot. You do. Sorry. Because a grant has certain stipulations, correct? Right? And a contract is different based on the needs. So a contract covers a few things in foster care. So that most organizations work with youth, and they will tell you that they work with an at-risk population. So I will tell you that is not my population. So we confirmed for the city. So sex trafficking is my only population. That's it. So I will tell you 43% of our youth are trafficked by their families. People always ask me, well, what does that mean? I think that's always interesting when we say that in the U.S., right? Because if I said that internationally, and I did over the weekend, I was in Morocco and I said that, and they said, yes, families, we get it. In the U.S., we don't want to believe that. So we say, well, what does that mean? It means they family traffic them, family control, that's what that means. Yeah. And I think it's hard for some reason. Then people ask me the next piece, I'll tell you, are most of the parents on drugs? Well, most of it's actually intergenerational, right? And so this has been taught to them through generations. And maybe their grandmother trafficked them or the uncle, but it's part of that family. So I said 43%. 88% of our youth are African American, and the other 12% are Latina. And so they're gang control. So all gang control in the Latino population. That'd be the two main gangs here, which will be MS-13 and 18th Street Los Focos. Well, it's a little bit different because then people ask me the next question. If you have those both two gangs, aren't they rivals? Not with sex trafficking, because they're being trafficked, that's it. What rival are you going to get out of them? They know each other. They're trafficked. So it's very different than you have in the 90s and early 2000s where you were in gangs and girls moved up on a tier, right? It's no tier. So everyone is definitely sex trafficked, and that's it. And so it's actually the one part where MS-13 and 18th Street Los Locos actually don't fight. They do sell girls amongst each other, and that does happen, and that actually happens, right, amongst the girls who are African Americans as well, right? You get sold, pimps sell you to other pimps. So they'll be threatened to sell you to another pimp that's more abusive. So when we try to say that this is modern day slavery, I say it's slavery. I never say it's modern because I don't see nothing modern about it. That just sounds like slavery. It didn't really sound like there was some type of modern twist to it. It's slavery, right? And so I want you to get that in your head for the next things, right, that I tell you, because let's talk about that percentage of our youth who are family controlled, which is a huge percentage of our population, which that will also be both boys and girls. So here in DC, then you'll say, well, Tina, why don't we see these cases, trafficking cases of boys? Well, we also find that's the hardest because all of the boys are African American. And in the African American community is actually the parents, usually the mother, who refuses actually to move the case forward. And that's because they don't want people to think that their son is gay. So I don't think we talk about that enough as well in the African American community, what that still means to be defined as gay. And to the point of where you don't even want to pursue a case where a child was definitely raped, right, and trafficked. So we'll say that as being the next few parts. And then the next piece we'll say of what we do at Courtney's house at the drop-in center. I think people always say we need younger populations that connect with the youth. And people will tell you and ask me all the time, at your age, whatever that may be, is it hard to connect with the youth? Is it a gap within it? And maybe because I'm a big old kid, but I would say no. I've never seen this gap. And really because sadly enough, the experience is still the exact same, right? And so having a survivor, even with the boys, to talk about, because my life wasn't just sex trafficking. There's a lot that happened within my life that can also connect to our boy population as well. So what we saw a lot of happening here that also people don't talk about enough, but I've been saying a long time. The amount of youth being trafficked overseas. Our African American youth being trafficked. So we don't talk about that a lot, do we? When I first started doing this movement, 100 years ago? You and I, 100 years ago. People, I said this a long time ago, U.S. citizens being trafficked, da-da-da. Now, most people will ask, how do you find out the information? The real issue that people are reporting is they don't have a relationship with the people they serve. Think about that for a moment. Not a number of people that come into the program, a relationship. And so we have a relationship at Courtney's house. I don't know why I'm talking like this, but we good. So, how did we find out and what was happening? What we were seeing were 3 places. Number 1 was Togo. Right, I see everyone's face like Togo in Africa. Well, what is the place that they can reach all youth? Online. So where were we seeing all this information from? Instagram. When talking of Instagram, Don and I, and many people there had to also talk about racism. See, the way people who are trafficked, who are Caucasian, are actually different than it is who is African American. If you go online and our youth, and I should tell you, all our Latina youth are not over the age of 16. I don't have any boys over the age of 17. So we're talking about a very young population. So what was happening online during the pandemic was kids was home all day and they was bored. And my theory, and so here we have something called Hope Court. Hope Court is a commercially sexually exploited court for youth here in DC who are also in foster care, and then youth who are not in foster care. So it's no charge, right, for foster care youth. They're in foster care. They don't have a charge. They do make sure that they have services, wraparound services. So what happened that we started seeing was one was Togo, the next one was Brazil, and then the third place would be Mexico and Guadalajara. Now, the first thing you'll say is, let's go backwards. Guadalajara had to be the Latino population, right? And the Latino gangs. So they were all African American, and it was the Latino gang. So actually, it was the Latino gangs. Not only that, two of the men who are currently in jail right now were trafficking our youth who were 12 and 13 African American girls. Met them online on Snapchat, and the men were illegally here, and so those Latino men were illegally here in the U.S. So I think what happens is this: in our heads, we also have like a divide, right? There's this racial divide, and then in the life we try to have this divide, Latino divide. Listen, this is about buyers. So most of the buyers, when you're African American, are Caucasian, Latina, and African. That's what it is. And so if you are Latino, when you have Latina girls, that's expected. But do you have an African American girl? Because that's more money if you're with a Latino group. Do we understand that? And so what we saw pick up. Let's talk about quickly with an example of our youth who is African American. She's 15 years old, met this guy in Togo. How we found out. So our youth, we have a relationship with our youth. We also have a huge online presence. We have an Instagram group with all of our kids so that I know all of their Finsta accounts. Everybody know what a Finsta account is. If you don't and you have children and grandchildren, come holler at me later. Auntie, I'm going to find it for you in 3.2 seconds. You're going to be upset, but it's okay. You won't stop. So all of them have one, okay? Everyone. The boys, the girls, everybody got one. And so they tell us what those are. That's why we have an Instagram group, right? So that I can see all of what they see. So it's very different for Latina girls and African American girls, because what they see in their DMs are naked pictures of men masturbating with their penises. They're like 12, 13, but they lied about their age to get on the Instagram, so they're getting all these DMs. People are asking you outright, like, let me cash app you, but you all you have to do is send me a picture of your face because you're so pretty today. Great. And then they cash app them right away, $20. And then that's like the how this kind of happens on this end. So she met this guy and she was very excited. And she told me all about Togo, which wasn't that much, that it was in Africa. And that's it. You got to remember, she's 15. She's from DC, she's never been outside of DC a day in her life. So she told me, and all the kids were using the word, we're going to go on vacation. I said, vacation? Well, hold up. So in foster care, you all, they don't have their own social security card and your birth certificate. Your social worker has that. So you actually don't have access to it. So they'll ask for that to say, I need my ID, right? So what was happening was they don't have their ID. So they were all going to social workers and stuff and us and asking for their ID. I said, well, what you need your ID for? And they're like, I want a passport. And I'm like, oh, no, wait. Wait a minute. And so here's the interesting part. Now we're like, wait a minute, they want a passport. Come on. So we did not give them their information to get a passport, right? Well, guess what? A week later, I talked to her, she comes into the center, and she shows me her social security card, and not a passport yet. Almost. I got 1 minute, so that's it. No, I'm just joking. Let me hurry up with this story. And so, with that being said, no, she got her ID. So the first thing she says to me is, does this look fake? So I'm like, I'm a very honest person. So you haven't guessed this. So I'm like, nah, actually you look pretty good. Where you get it done at Columbia Road on the street on the corner of 17th Street. How'd you know? I don't know, I guess. On the corner at 12 o'clock on Columbia Road, real quick. Okay, on the right hand side. So she has that, but wait for it. So I tell the team, tell the judge, okay, we put alerts out. But then the next step is we're like, okay, remember during the pandemic and you couldn't get a passport? right? You couldn't even renew anything. And so next thing we know, 2 weeks later, she calls us on FaceTime. And she's literally at the passport agency here in DC. And she shows me her passport. It's also a man in the background that I noticed. So I hurry up, I tell everybody, and the first thing the judge says is, Miss Front, how do you think she got a legal passport? We need to look into this. I said, well, somebody is doing something illegal. Well, not only her, 5 other of our youth all got real passports during this time. We asked over and over again, and then as of today, there has been still no investigation on how they got the passport to anybody at the passport agency. I'll end it in telling you how this ended. This ended, well, like this. She did get on the plane. So she was calling us again. Having a relationship helps a whole lot. Because I'm on the phone with her. And we, as a staff, looked up all the surrounding airports, what time the plane would leave. Because she showed us the ticket. She said she was leaving. This is happening. But she didn't tell us the airport. And I mean, that's on purpose, right? These are kids. They ain't gonna give you all the information. I wish it would help a whole lot. But that didn't happen. So now we're looking through, didn't see it. Next thing I know, I can't figure out where she is. Well, she's in New York. She calls me, and guess what? These traffickers are smart because he got her an Uber to JFK. That was so smart because we were able to go to court because she does have legal custody. So we had to literally get the judge out the bed, and you had to get an order that we could submit her information to the airport because, again, foster care has legal guardianship. So you actually have to get a court order to do that. So we do that. We're able to submit information so that we can bring it out. I find out that she's in JFK because she told us. So that we were able to, guess what? Here's the interesting part of all this. Now, the judge asked me another question real quick. She said, Ms. Front, I've heard about on the airlines and they found all these people who were trafficked. They found young girls before they got them. I said, yes, ma'am, they sure did, and they were white. Mm-hmm. And let me explain why the next steps that are important. She passed TSA just fine. She thought Africa was a country that wasn't far from Miami. But nobody questioned her because she's 15. Nobody questioned her. She got onto the plane just fine. When we asked Homeland Security to get her off, they did because they were able to find her there and they got her off. And that's what they did. They did just that. They got her off and left her and called us to get her back. There was no interview. Twice this happened to the same child. She tried twice to go to Togo. Seriously. Second time she was in panic. She said, if I get off this time, I'll owe these people. And it's true. The other young lady, which we don't have time, who was 13, African American, and they did catch her on the way to Guadalupe Harbor, only because they were going to Alabama and other places first, the trafficker. My point is, what is different about this? One, you never heard about this on the news. When our youth came and she was scared, and the other young youth very afraid, and we talked about it, and she even said, I wasn't on the news or anything. She said, but Miss Tina, if I was white, I would have been on the news and they would have had a whole parade. But think about that. They would have had a whole parade, she said, if I come back and they found me. But you didn't hear about this because you only heard it because I said something to you. And we were the ones that were able to have a relationship and get her off of the plane. So although we're hearing about all of these reports, and it is very important, but I still want you to understand what they did say about that racism piece is very true. Because if we were not involved, just like the judge said, she said, Ms. Frank, I think you rescued her. And that's what I'm going to call it, she said, because if you were not involved, she would have been in Togo. By the way, one of her friends did go to Togo, and she isn't able to find her. And we're still looking for that friend today. So thank you all very much. I appreciate all your time.
So much, Tina. That's so much information and things that we just don't really think about. So I appreciate you for that. Next, we have Emma Seavey from the Advocacy Coordinator for CAP International. And we have Jonathan Mashler, the Executive Director of CAP International. How'd I do?
Perfect.
Amazing.
They were my teachers. Okay, thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, and a special thanks to NCOSE for hosting us and co-sponsoring this event. Thank you to Work Without Exploitation. Thank you to Rescue Freedom. A special thanks to Rita in the back, who is our amazing friend and ally, who's been such a supporter during this whole tour. We thank the Embassy of Sweden. We thank the Embassy of France for sponsoring this event. We are so happy to have you with us today. And this is the last date of the Last Girl First tour, so let me tell you that I am honored and privileged to be with you to discuss the findings of the reports in Washington. So more than half of minors victims of sexual exploitation in King County, Washington, are Black girls, although they only represent less than 7% of the population of the state. 84% of prostituted persons on an average of 13 European countries are migrants. 50 to 90% of women in prostitution in Western Canadian cities are indigenous, although they represent less than 4% of the total population of the country. So it is a visible reality that we have long been ignoring. But prostitution disproportionately impacts women and girls from the most systemically discriminated communities. We're talking about indigenous women and girls, African American girls. We're talking about women and girls from racial, ethnic, religious minorities, displaced, from the oppressed castes. They are the last girls. They are those who are the margins, who suffer from full force systemic discriminations. Those who are deprived of access to rights. There are those who we as a society have chosen to designate as prostitute, as a class part that has to satisfy the male-driven demand for the purchase of a sexual act. So with the Last Girl First report, we decided to give a platform to these women and girls. We mapped the situation of prostituted persons in more than 80 countries. We include grassroots experts working with prostituted persons. We include survivors, but also leaders of the communities most impacted by prostitution. Because in order to build laws and policies that are most adapted to the needs of prostituted persons, we need to understand what the prostitution system really is, what it thrives on, what are its historical, political, social roots, and how today it has become this massive system of sexual exploitation of women and girls. So what did we find? First of all, I think it's important to address that prostitution is not just a person selling their sexual services or selling their body, as we often tend to hear. It is a complex system that involves several actors, and at the minimum, the sex buyers who pay to obtain a sexual act, and the pimp who is there to exploit the prostitution of another person. The prostitution system we found follows a pattern. So it preys on different factors of vulnerability, whether poverty, homelessness, minority of age, experience of childhood sexual abuse, addictions to drugs, alcohol, but also expressed gender identity and sexual orientation. These are all levers of exploitation for traffickers, but also for sex buyers. The report also explores how the prostitution system is actually the product and intersection of all existing patterns of domination. So patriarchy, racism, capitalism, but also colonialism, imperialism, class domination, war, militarization, they all intersect and have a role to play in shaping the prostitution system. So without spoiling too much of the report for you, I'll give you an insight on 3 or 4 of these root causes of the prostitution system. Prostitution is first of all rooted in our patriarchal system. According to the United Nations, 94% to 96% of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation in the world are women and girls. This system is highly gendered, and we need to understand that it first targets women and girls. They are everywhere in the world, almost exclusively the one that constitutes the supply in the market of prostitution, while men are almost exclusively the ones that constitute the demand side. And if we analyze it as a market, prostitution would not exist if sex buyers did not buy sex. They are the sole reason the prostitution market exists, because as in any market, if there's no demand, then there's no supply. Prostitution is rooted in a long patriarchal tradition of male sexual entitlement to women, of a desire of men to control the women's bodies, to access them. The prostitution system reflects an archaic vision of male sexuality, one that is based on their irrepressible needs to satisfy their sexual desires. Prostitution enshrines the right to dispose of the body of another person. And so the prostitution system is a part of the continuum of violence that has been perpetrated against women by men. The repetition of sexual acts without physical desire, but economically, psychologically, or physically forced, has nothing to do with sexuality. It is a violence in and of itself. Studies show that 2/3 of prostituted persons have experienced PTSD at rates higher than Vietnam War veterans. More than half have experienced rape. 2/3 of them have experienced sexual assault in prostitution. And this violence is the work of sex buyers and gangs. By placing the human body in the field of market, what the prostitution system does is that it cuts women into pieces. What we see from sex buyers and their perceptions of women is that they see them as parts of anatomy. They see them as breasts, as a mouth, as a vagina. And so the prostitution system is actually rooted in the commodification and the objectification of women and girls. In the prostitution system, women and girls are subjected to package deals in legal brothels in Germany and the Netherlands. As a German doctor says, in Germany, you can pay 60 euros and have a woman, a hot dog, and a burger in a brothel. So the prostitution system progressively dehumanizes women to transform them into objects so that they can then be bought and sold in our ultra-capitalist system. Prostitution is further rooted in racism, imperialism, and colonialism. So we have often heard that the prostitution system has always existed, that it's the oldest profession in the world. But that's not true. In fact, in many matrilineal indigenous communities in North America, for example, prostitution did not exist prior to the European invasions. And so colonizers, along with genocide, along with forced displacement, with cultural destruction, introduced sexual violence in communities where they were known to be very equal. And the prostitution system was used as a tool to conquer, as the lands, the bodies of indigenous women and girls, and to humiliate the colonized people. Colonialist and imperialist powers have also used the regulatory approach to prostitution, so the legalization approach to prostitution, to dominate the colonized. The research underlines, for example, how in Maghreb countries, in Asia, in India, in Korea, the imperialist powers, whether the British, whether the American GIs, or the French, have actually organized the prostitution of local women and have pushed at an industrial scale the sex tourism, the sex industries that exist in the countries that have been touched by imperialism. So the prostitution system as it exists today is a legacy of colonialism and imperialism. The distinction made by the settlers between the indigenous savage and the white civilized is very much at work today. And how do we see that? The overrepresentation of women and girls from indigenous communities in prostitution, for example, is an example and a product of this history. The phenomenon of colonization has created an intergenerational trauma on many indigenous communities. It has shaped discriminatory systems that target women of color and the poorest women. We're talking about the foster care system, as Tina taught. We're talking about the school system where Black girls, women and girls from minorities are more disconnected than their white peers. We're talking about the criminal justice system that excludes the poorest women. And so all of these factors combined with this history have exacerbated, for example, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of intrafamilial violence, of addictions among many indigenous communities. It have exacerbated forced displacement, which make women and girls from indigenous communities all the more vulnerable to prostitution. Military imperialist prostitution also relied on several rules, including very strict sanitary controls and health checks that were imposed on women who were detained in brothels. And these health checks had actually one justification. It was to preserve the white civilized society at all costs from the spread of venereal diseases from the indigenous women who were exploited in the brothels. What we see today is that in countries that have legalized prostitution, such as Germany, the same hygienist logics apply. What we also see in these countries, for example, taking again Germany, is that 95% of the women and girls who are exploited in the legal brothels of the countries are actually undocumented migrants. So nothing has really changed in terms of racial, in terms of class domination relationship between sex buyers and prostituted persons. Black women and girls in the US are disproportionately targeted by the prostitution system. A study shows that they are perceived as less innocent, more sexually promiscuous, less in need of affection, and more independent than their white peers. These perceptions, these racist perceptions in the US of Black girls is rooted in the slavery past of the country, and we need to connect these dots. Docile, submissive, these are the words that were used by sex buyers on Sex Buyers Forum to describe Asian women in prostitution. Stupid, enjoying violence, Pocahontas. These were the words used by the same sex buyers to describe indigenous women and girls in prostitution. Purchasing a sexual act today, we can no longer ignore that it's rooted in this imperialist and colonialist history. It is a racist act. It is a fundamentally racist act. Prostitution is also rooted in class domination, and we always we forget to speak about that a lot. Although it is not always the sole cause, belonging to a social disadvantaged class and the resulting experience of precariousness that comes with it constitutes a determining factor in entering and remaining in the prostitution system. So the main victims of prostitution are those who are cut off from the formal economy, those who cannot access the employment markets that our systems have created. They are those who sell the last things that they have left, which is their body. Observing the impact of the economic crisis on the prostitution of women in Europe, for example, really shows that. So Portugal and Greece have known some economic crisis in 2000 and 2012. These countries have adopted austerity measures that were especially hard on working and middle classes. women were overrepresented among the unemployed. What we have seen in Greece during this economic crisis is an unprecedented increase of 150% of the prostitution of Greek women, because they were in a survival mode, because they did not have access to their most basic rights. So knowing all of these facts, knowing that prostitution is rooted in so many different oppressions, we are today facing a collective choice. Do we accept that the prostitution system targets the most marginalized in our society? Do we accept that fact, and do we choose to profit from that? Do we choose to legalize prostitution as certain countries have done? Well, some ultra-liberal countries have indeed followed that path, and under a false progressive code, they have trivialized, empowered, and glamorized the vision of prostitution as sex work, as a free choice. By doing so, they have chosen to ignore the inherent violence of the prostitution system, and they have chosen to put aside the intersectional oppressions that are at work in the prostitution system. Because the women and girls who are in prostitution are exactly those who we talk about: indigenous, displaced, oppressed castes, minorities, poor women. They are those who are homeless. They are those who suffer from addictions. They are those who have experienced childhood sexual abuse and many other vulnerabilities. So if we often hear that prostitution is a choice, how come it touches those who least have choice? If prostitution were a choice, it is also obvious that wealthier people would be represented among the victims. It would be obvious that men would be represented among the victims. So this sex work position that certain countries have adopted actually aims at masking the class relations in the prostitution system. It fails to take into account the social context in which prostitution develops. It fails to take into account the race, class, and sex dynamics that are at work in the relationship between sex buyers and prostituted persons. Countries that have adopted this position expressly say that some lives are worth more than others. That the situation that some women are born into, the sexism, the poverty, the racism, is somehow their destiny, as activist Susan Chase shares. So they have expressed their will that these people remain subordinate in our society. But other countries, like France, like Sweden, have pushed by feminist movements, have chosen to reaffirm the universality of human rights, of human dignity, equality, by providing protection and dignified living conditions to the most marginalized in our societies and to prostituted persons. So at the end of the report, we drafted a set of recommendations by survivors, listening to the advice of survivors, leaders of communities most impacted, and grassroots experts. And I will just give a few of them that I think should be included in every laws regarding prostitution in every country. We have a model that has been proven efficient, and it's the abolitionist model or the equality model. It is one that tackles all the factors of vulnerabilities that are at work in prostitution, and that also allows us to reflect on the deeper oppressions that intersect in the prostitution system. This model centers a holistic approach, and it is based on 5 fundamental pillars. The first one is the decriminalization of prostituted persons. They should never bear the brunt of the criminal charge, because we need to understand that they are not the criminals. They are victims of a system and of several circumstances that put them in this situation. All prostituted persons should be able to benefit from an exit program. They have the right to exit prostitution. And this means that states should allocate financial allowance monthly for these prostituted persons, should allocate psychosocial support, vocational training, but also all the rights that actually foster the material conditions so that prostituted persons can exit prostitution without being in a situation of survival. The third pillar is to tackle the demand that produces these markets, because as we said, sex buyers are the sole reason some women are in prostitution. And we need to penalize the demand, we need to penalize sex buyers, and that's also a question of justice, of holding people accountable for their actions and the violence they make prostituted persons suffer from. Pimping and trafficking should be criminalized, and we should have a very strong stance on that, there is no discussion. And we should also have prevention strategies to educate the general public on the realities of our prostitution and to deconstruct the stereotypes that we might have on it, such as prostitution is sex work or prostitution is a choice. But all of these measures can be completed and should be completed in a general manner by providing access to housing, by providing a minimum income above the poverty line, fighting all forms of racist and neo-colonial practices, strengthening the feminist discourse. Putting the last girl first means centering the ones that our systems have failed. And abolishing the system of prostitution is at the heart of the anti-patriarchy, anti-racist, anti-colonialist fights. It is at the heart of the social justice fight. Because abolishing prostitution is a fight for the people and for the most marginalized, for equality between women and men. So this research is basically a call to action so that every last girl can be first until there is no more last and no more first. Thank you.
Does it work? Oh no.
No.
All right. I will stand still because I prefer. So hi everyone, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I want to thank NCOSE, of course, for your amazing work and support, not only today but for the previous weeks of communication and supporting us. I want to thank, of course, the representatives of the Swedish Embassy and the French Embassy. It's really important for us that you're here and for our members. We have 27 members over 5 members over 27 countries. And I can tell you that when they have a problem, very often one of the first things they tell us is that we should talk about it to France and Sweden. So your initiative is really important for us. We are very happy also to be with our members, Rada from CAPA, our member Rita, who has been kind of our guardian angel all over this tour. Can you hear me? Yeah? Well, okay, I'm trying. And of course, I want to thank our co-sponsors, World Without Exploitation and Rescue Freedom, of course. So, as it was described before, and I don't need to add a lot on it, we see that prostitution is at the intersection of all patterns of violence and oppression. The sexual act obtained by sex buyers from women in prostitution is always obtained under coercion. Either it is the physical coercion of the pimps and traffickers, or either it is the socio-economic coercion from the society. Almost systematically, these two forms of constraints combine. As abolitionists and as CAP, we consider the sexual act obtained in prostitution as a form of pay rape. Then, prostitution raises a simple question in our societies. What options do we want to offer collectively to the most discriminated and marginalized among us? So, it's a simple question, and there are two options. Either we propose the unlimited exploitation of their bodies as a means of survival, or either we work together in order to provide a safety net, to preserve rights and dignities of the people in situations at risk of being in prostitution, and that's the communities work I'm talking about. So, certain countries have chosen the first option by legalizing prostitution and by making a differentiation between a so-called free prostitution, reframed as sex work, and a forced prostitution, reframed as sexual exploitation or trafficking. Germany, for instance, penalizes, in theory, trafficking under the Article 232 of the Penal Code. And the penalties range from 6 months to 10 years in jail. But at the same time, they have legalized all forms of what they call free prostitution, also known as sex work. And so everything is legalized, including brothels, advertisement, and job offers through human resources companies. The German government collects taxes from the activity of prostitution. Actually, and under the international law, by making profit from the activity of prostitution of others, the German state behaves itself as a victim. So, in Germany we have 83 million residents, 400,000 prostituted persons. On these 400,000 prostituted persons, 95% of them are foreigners. Only 330 prostituted persons have been identified as trafficking victims per year over the last 6 years. So 330 over 400,000. Only 76 prostituted persons over 400,000 asked for the sex worker legal status. Because this legal status that is supposed to create new rights doesn't change the reality of what prostitution is. And so the people who are concerned and who are into these situations are just not interested by having so-called administrative rights, which are not, and having to check, having to go through regular health checks, because it doesn't help them. There are now 2,290 identified registered legal brothels and many more illegal. And 1 million men in Germany buy sex every day. So this has completely normalized prostitution in the country. This has shaped a perception of women, a different perception of women in the country by institutionalizing and normalizing the commodification of women in the country. And this has allowed criminal rings and networks to bloom. I would like to quote Manfred Paulus, who is a German policeman who has been in charge for 30 years of prostitution and trafficking in women as head of a criminal inspection unit in Ulm, and he is now a European Union trafficking expert. So Manfred Paulus says, in Germany, we now have up to 100% of women imported from abroad for prostitution. It should be clear that Belarusian women from the Chernobyl area or a Roma from the ghetto in Romania can never make her way alone to Germany to work in prostitution. The women are trafficked into this country, and in this sector, highly criminal structures have developed. Organized crime controls the business. The demanded distinction between prostitution and human trafficking gives reason for fearing the worst. There are obviously people involved who are not at all or too little informed about the milieu and will consciously or not give in to the myth of free prostitution whispered to them by lobbyists. There is only one place where I meet voluntary prostituted persons, in talk shows. There, after 30 years of working in the milieu, I saw for the first time women who since their youth had nothing else in mind but to make men happy in this manner, and that out of conviction, and who had never seen a peep. But voluntary is a magic word. If prostitution takes place voluntarily, then the brothel operator, the bar owner, and the John no longer have a problem. And then the police, judiciary system, and political systems are helpless. This is why many people really love this word. But the truth is quite different. Speaking of voluntariness is frankly, to my mind, quite cynical. Today we have noble brothels, legal brothels, decorated in marble and stainless steel. This does not exclude that pimps are hiding behind this facade, and behind them some mysterious companies. And if we look behind these letterbox companies, then we discover Albanian clans, the Russian mafia, or the Hells Angels. By the way, these are the same criminal networks that are currently operating at the Ukrainian border to bring back Ukrainian women in legal hotels in Germany. I want to say a word also about the same model that has been implemented and adopted in the Netherlands. Just to give an example of what happens when you give a sexual act, you give to sexual act a transactional value. It is now legal in the Netherlands for a driving license instructor to propose a sexual act as a means of payment to a student that could not afford driving classes. Why? Because the country is being ideologically consistent. When you turn a sexual act into a commercial service, then there is no limit anymore. It's the end of anti-harassment policies at work, because your boss could propose a sexual act. It's not harassment, it's a service. It's the same way as now in Netherlands, and this program, by the way, is called Ride for a Ride. It is now legal for driving license instructors to propose a sexual act as a means of payment. And guess who will have no other choice but to accept? The young women and girls who don't have the financial resources to pay for the driving license. So we are always talking about the last one. I want to say a word about Finland, because I've heard a lot about Finland being quoted as a kind of compromise between the equality model and the full decree or sex work model. So Finland makes the same differentiation between forced and free prostitution, so between sex work and trafficking, by penalizing sex buyers, but only in the framework of sexual acts obtained with victims of trafficking. At the same time, it allows this free prostitution to be tolerated, and it allows the free prostitution market to bloom. So right now, in Finland, we have, for a small country of 5 million residents, 10 to 15,000 prostituted persons, most of them being foreigners. Of course, it doesn't work. The police arrest no clients, no sex buyers. Why? Because it's a perfect excuse for them. They just have to pretend that they didn't know. And of course, it's easy for them to say that they didn't know because it's not written victim of trafficking on sexual ads that you will find on the sex buyers forums. So it's a perfect excuse for sex buyers and pimps. And as a consequence, and this is actually what shows the impact of the implementation of this differentiation, the number of victims of trafficking is constantly increasing in the country. In the last years, every year, Finland has reached its highest record of identified victims of trafficking, meaning that in 2020, it was the highest number of victims of trafficking identified in all the country's history. The previous record was 2019. The previous one was 2018. We can guess that the next one will be next year. So what we see is that these distinctions do not work, and that when we try to make laws regarding prostitution, considering that there could be free prostitution and forced prostitution, it never works. Only the sex buyers and pimps are being protected, are being favored by these legislations, and it only makes the situation of prostituted persons worse. And then you have the abolitionist model, or the equality model, created, invented by Sweden, who opened the web in 1999, then followed by many countries. And I want to talk about France, because France has taken an interesting holistic approach, creating a law, we call a framework law, modifying 9 legislative codes in the country. So as abolitionists, we consider that prostitution itself, not free or forced, prostitution itself is a form of violence against women. That the repetition of sexual acts without physical desire, but instead experienced as a consequence of financial need, of inequality, or as an exploitation of vulnerability, constitutes sexual violence in and of itself. So I won't repeat the 5 pillars of the law, but Emma already described them: full decriminalization of prostituted persons, recognition as prostitution as a form of violence, and I want to insist on that because recognizing prostitution as a form of violence allows the creation of a status of victim of prostitution, which is very important because it allows the access to an exit pathway, including different rights that I will detail a little bit further. But why it is important to provide and to create the status of victim of prostitution? Because if you condition the status of victim and the rights that are created with the status to a situation of exploitation, then you make the access to these rights very difficult to victims of both prostitution and exploitation. Because then you put the responsibility of proving that there is exploitation on the victims. To show that there is exploitation, you have to show that there is a link of dependence or subordination or basically any kind of constraint. So it means that you will ask the person in prostitution to prove that she is being exploited. It doesn't work. It never works. And it actually deters the persons who are in these situations to try to access their rights, right? But saying that you're in a situation of prostitution is actually much more easy, right? So, stages of victim of prostitution. Reinforce access to justice for all victims and repression of pimping, targeting the demand, and prevention and sensitization of the population. So right now, in France, for an equivalent population to Germany, there are between 30,000 and 40,000 prostituted persons, which is actually 10 times less than the situation in Germany for an equivalent population. Zero legal brothel. Decriminalization. I want to insist on that because very often our opponents portray us as carceral feminists or people willing to be very repressive. The first impact of the abolitionist model or the equality model is the full decriminalization of all prostituted persons. Before the law, over the last 10 years, an average of 2,500 prostituted persons were arrested every year. Since the law passed, this number is 0. Protection and reintegration. So currently, 800 women in prostitution had access to an exit pathway. Among those accompanied by our member organizations, 80% of them were in a stable job situation at the end of the exit pathway. So these exit pathways can last for 1 or 2 years. They give access to a various set of rights, right to housing, vocational training, residency status in the victim's arena, access to financial support, and basically an entire holistic protection and reintegration pathway, also with psychosocial and psychological support, of course. Regarding justice, we have heard a lot before obtaining the law that decriminalizing prostituted persons would complicate even more the work of the police and of the justice, because the prostituted persons would not have to denounce their pimps anymore to access rights and protection. This has been proven wrong. First, because, of course, if you're in a situation of prostitution and if the police is supposed to penalize you, you won't trust them and you won't try to reach them to access your rights and protection. It won't work. And what we saw actually is that this decriminalization led to a 54% increase in proceedings against pimps and traffickers between 2016 and 2019, so in only the first 3 years after the adoption of the law. And the volume of compensation received by the victims has been multiplied by 7. Then, targeting the demand. So we have 8,000 sex buyers who have been penalized. If it's the first offense in France, you have 2 options. Either you pay a fine of 1,500 euros, if there are no aggravated circumstances, of course. either you also pay, but a lower amount of money, and you have to attend a sensitization workshop. This is important because it shows the ambition of our abolitionist approach, because it's not only the repression that we want to change the mindset of men and of sex buyers in particular. There are questionnaires, anonymous questionnaires, that are available at the end of the sensitization workshops. 90% of the men who attended the workshops declared that at the end they had a changed perception of what prostitution is, and that they would not try to buy sex again. So we can believe them or not, but they have the pressure regarding the response, and we know that the intervention of social workers, professionals, and all survivors of the prostitution system to these workshops will make a difference. And then prevention and sensitization. So we want to change the mindset of the global population. Right now, we made a survey in 2019. 78% of the French population have a positive view of the law. 84% of the youth between 18 and 24 years old are in favor of maintaining the law, and 81% of women in the country consider prostitution as a form of violence. So there is a last visual I want to share with you, because we have, I think, made our points regarding the intersectional oppression, regarding the importance of fighting the prostitution system from the point of view of human rights and equality. But maybe some people are more sensitive to financial arguments. So we know in France that, for instance, it costs 7 more times more expensive to continue the system of prostitution than to end it. We know that an exit program for one person in prostitution is around 60,000 euros. We know that if we want to provide to the 40,000 prostituted persons an exit pathway, it would cost over 10 years 241 million per year, or 2,410,000,000 over 10 years. Continuing the system of prostitution, regarding all the costs, tax evasion, human costs for prostituted persons, etc., cost to the society 1.6 billion a year. It's more than 8 billion over 10 years. So I just wanted to make this point clear, because it's a matter of human rights, it's a matter of dignity, of equality. It's also a matter of how we run our states, our countries, our societies. So to end my intervention, I would like to say that it's work in progress. I mean, we are happy with the results right now, but we want 10 times more. We want 10 times more of everything, of exit programs, of sex barriers being penalized, etc. But it's already 10 times better, even 100 times better than what we had before 2016. I'd like to say that this policy of collective emancipation was obtained because brave political leaders, supported by the civil society and empowered by the powerful voices of survivors of prostitution, put aside their differences to agree on fundamental values: gender equality, human dignity, social justice, values to which prostitution, even when it's renamed sex work, is fundamentally opposed. And yes, it's the last event of our tour. We had the privilege to have a kind of a view of the situation in the US. And just to share with you our feeling, the first feeling we had was that abolitionists here have been kind of intimidated, have been kind of bullied by organizations spreading fakely progressist narratives, reframing prostitution as sex work, saying that sex work is work. Well, when you're an organization and you want to appear as progressist, claiming that sex work is work doesn't make you progressist. It just makes you the useful idiot of pimps and traffickers. What we think is that we are the real progressists in the room, because we advocate first for sexual freedom. We want sexuality that is based on mutual desire. We want a sexuality emancipated from all the intersectional oppressions that are described in the last First report. We are advocates for social justice because we refuse the unlimited exploitation of the most marginalized communities. We want the safety net, not the exploitation. We are the advocates for racial equality because we call out, we identify, and we fight the racial and colonial roots and patterns that are at work in the prostitution system. And so the racial equality fight is our fight, not theirs. And of course, we are the advocates for gender equality because we are fighting actively the oldest patriarchal oppression in the world. So I think it's time to be unapologetically abolitionist, to be proud to be abolitionist. And wow, that was the message. Let's organize, let's fight. Thank you.
Thank you, CAP International, for all of the work that took a lot of work in terms of research and preparing this report. Really appreciate you for that. Last, but of course not least, I want to introduce to you Anita Carter, who is the founder of Breaking Free. She's going to speak to us as it pertains to survivors, buyers, traffickers, and who should be held accountable. But before you speak, I just want to remind the audience that after Ms. Carter has spoken, we will be taking questions and answers, not only from the audience, but those of you that are online, if you would just also place your questions in the chat. So with that, without further ado, and you can either be seated or you can have a the papers in the hand.
Okay, I already know my stone work, and I don't need it. But I just too want to thank CAP. We are a member of CAP, so and NCOSE for hosting this. As she said, my name is Benita Carter, and I've been doing this work now for over 30 years. I started way back in the 70s. Don't try to figure out how old I am. And not the 70s, but the 80s, the late 80s. But I will say this, just to tell a little bit about my story. Back in the 70s, I'm from Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul area. And what happened was back in the 70s, Party Line, a group called Party Line. You might have heard of them here. I don't know if DC has this strip clubs that came to Minnesota back in the early 70s. And what happened is my friend and me decided at this time that we were going to go to these strip clubs and look at getting a job. They didn't call them strippers, they called them dancers. And we were young and we just thought, hey, dancing is something we do all the time. Why not try? Go on and, put in an application, whatever you have to do. So that's what we did. She was white, I'm black. We went for the interviews. And we both got hired. And anyway, what happened was they began to send us out to different clubs. This is how it works. And after about a couple weeks, what they did was they split us up. She went down one track and they sent me down another track. And what I found out was that that's just the way it was, at least in Minnesota. And I find out from visiting other places, it's like that in other places too. Black women are sent down one I'm going to say road, and white women are sent down another road. And the clubs that they sent us to were much different than the clubs that they were sending white women to. But I'm not saying that any of it was real great. They weren't, because they weren't. But ours just happened to be a lot worse. And so anyway, without going into a lot of detail, because I don't have a whole lot of time, I ended up being able to get out. I didn't stay in it really, really long. And I realized that it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. It was taking me down a track I didn't want to go down. At this time, I was trying to get into college, and I thought, I'm going to make some quick money, some fast money. And I'm going to get that college money together, and I'm going to be in college, and have my tuition paid and all of this. And it didn't happen like that. It didn't happen like that. So what happened was I was able to get out. And I consider myself one of the lucky ones. My girlfriend, on the other hand, was not able to get out. She ended up staying in it and not getting out till she was 50 years old.
Wow.
And when I saw her, I hadn't seen her in all that time. We somehow saw each other in a store, you know, and I asked her, you know, well, what happened to you? You know what I mean? We just got separated. She just disappeared. And so she told me, she said, well, yesterday, I don't know, it wasn't yesterday, but a little while ago, she said, my boyfriend died. I said, your boyfriend died, and I knew immediately what that meant. What she did was, while in the stripping agency, she met a pimp. And I'm going to call him a hardcore pimp. There's different levels of pimps, and I'm not getting into all that. But she met a hardcore pimp, kept her in the life from a teenager is what I'm going to say, all the way up till she was 50 years old. So we started talking to one another and getting reconnected again, getting to know each other once again. And what happened is, after about a couple of years, I got a telephone call from her son. And her son told me she never woke up. She just died. And see, this stuff people say all the time. Why do you tell such hard stories, such sad stories? They're all sad. I've never had, in all the years that I've done this work, a woman tell me a happy, peppy, beautiful story. They're all sad stories because that's the life. And I've worked with over 1,000 women in prostitution over all of those years. I'm the founder of Breaking Free, and Breaking Free worked with, at that time, up until probably maybe about 5 years ago, about 500 women a year, women and girls. That's a lot of women and girls, helping them to get out of the life of prostitution. So anyway, what I want to talk about today is, like they said, is who should be held accountable. And a lot of the things that I was going to talk about, people have talked about, which is okay, because sometimes we need to hear it over and over before it really sinks in and helps us to recognize. Because see, right now there's so many views about, should we legalize this or decriminalize this, or should we not? And I want you to think deeply about that. Cap just got up and broke it down, what's happening in different parts of the world. What model would we use if we legalized or fully decriminalized prostitution here? Would we call Germany and say, send us your person who can help us map it out here in the United States? Do we want to look like Germany? Do we want to look like them? Do we want to look like Finland? Who would we do it? I mean, we got legalized prostitution right here. You know, I've worked with women from the brothels in Nevada, where we just do our own thing. And I'm not saying that it looks any better in Nevada, but it doesn't look like a lot of that. But see, I'm going to get your name wrong, I'm sorry.
Emma.
Emma, okay. Emma talked about the inherent harm. A lot of people don't like to talk about that. I'm going to tell you what I call the inherent harm, okay? I'm going to say the inherent harm of prostitution is a sex act. Now some of you are saying, oh, no, sex act. It's a sex act. And why am I saying that? I want you to imagine the person that you love. The person that you're with every day. And you make love with that person. You heard what I called it? I said you make love with that person. And you enjoy it. We're all adults here. It's a good thing. But that person comes to you one time, twice, wanting again, 5 times a day, 10 times a day. They want to make love 15 times a day in one day. Something in your mind, I don't care where you're at, something's going to say, there's something wrong with this. Something's wrong with this picture here. Now I want you to think about that woman or that little girl that's involved in the life of prostitution. And she has to see this stranger, somebody she may not ever give the time of day to. 1 time a day, 2 times, 5 times, 10 times. He wants you to do this. Head, anal, anything he asks, he wants from her. Do you think he thinks, wow, she just had to do 5 people, 5 guys. And it doesn't matter her age. That is the inherent harm. That is the reason why women say, you know, I just keep washing myself. I just scrub, some till you bleed. And I just can't seem to get clean. I can't seem to get clean. It's just, it does something to you. Psychologically, spiritually. That's the kind of impact prostitution has. I want to say this, that, could somebody please give me water? My mouth is just getting really dry. I want to say this, that lots of times people are saying, you know, she chose it. You've heard that before. Thank you so much. They're saying that she chose it, you know, so she should be, and you hear women say it. I mean, I know that when, you know, when I was young, I said I liked it, I chose it. I thought that, you know, I really believed that. But I realized why I said that and why I did that. You can't live with yourself if you don't like something. If you don't like it, I mean, going home every day, you know, and you're saying, oh, I hate it, although you do that. But you tell other people, oh, it's not so bad. It really isn't so bad. And why is it? Because you have to wear a whole lot of hats when you're in prostitution. You know, you wear one hat that when I talk to you, you're going to hear something like, it's not that bad at that time. This time I'm telling you the true raw facts. At that time I would have probably said, no, it's really not that bad. Stripping and prostitution, it's not so bad because it helps you to be able to make it through that day. And then I go home and I tell my family something else. I work the 3rd shift. You know, I work 2nd shift. You got to have for everything you do when you're in that life. And it's part of the survival of being in that life. And all while I'm telling you this, I want you to think about it still. Should it be fully decriminalized? What would it look like? What would the impact be on the individual, not only the individual, on our nation as a whole? I think I saw something that you all put up there, said 400,000. That's a large number. 400,000 prostituted people that they know of. Over 1 million Johns. Okay? That's huge. Now I know our numbers are big here too. I'm not even going to try to, but I don't think they're that high. They might be. What do you think?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think they are.
You know what? That's frightening.
Yeah.
You know why it's frightening? Because I always say prostitution is no respecter of person. It's no respecter of person. It doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter your height. It doesn't matter your weight. It doesn't matter how much money you have. I've worked with young women whose parents were politicians up in Minnesota. Big money. Living on the lake, living large. See, these pimps don't care about that. That doesn't matter to them. All they see is one thing when they look at a woman. And I'm talking women mainly. I know boys are involved. But I've worked mainly with women. I have worked with some boys too. But It's been mainly women. When they see a woman, they see one thing. And what is even more scary is Johns, the tricks, the buyers, the traffickers. What do they see when they look at that little girl coming in there? That they can go into her and tell her, I want you to do this. And she's 12 years old. My youngest client has been 11 years old. 11 years old. And the story she tells me, I just want to say just a really, and I know I limited time, quick story here. The first client I had came from here, DC, back in the early 90s. She came to me at 27 years old, and what happened to her was she had been she was involved in the life, all of her life pretty much. She said it started when she was a little girl, molestation and the whole, rape, everything happened. By the time she was 12 years old, she said she decided to leave home. And a lot of kids decide around 11, 12, when they're having a bad home life, I'm out of here. She said she got less than 2 blocks from her house, right here in DC, and a man pulled up and asked her if she needed a ride. And I say he could tell that she was distressed. He could tell there was something going on with that little girl. But she's 12 years old. She was thinking, well, maybe this is the person who will help me. So she jumped in his car, and he just started asking her a bunch of questions. Filling her out, how's your family, what's going on? And of course, at 12 years old, she's telling me, my dad this, and stepdad was her stepdad. What do you think he did? Think he took her to child protection? You think he took her to some good family, church family No, he didn't. What he did was he pulled her over and he screwed her. Then what did he do? He took her to a malt shop, is what she called it, where a lot of kids hung out. And he introduced her to her first pimp. This was a trafficker, a trick. And he turned her out. She said he raped me all night at 12 years old. After the John raped me, then he raped me all night long. This is what happened to me. Think about this, deeply please. Kids. Someone in your life as a child. We got to start talking to our kids. Otherwise, the internet's going to talk to them. If we don't tell them the truth about what's going on out here. I heard a woman tell me the other day about, but she said if we just raise our children with a lot of love and, keep them in church and do this and that, you know what? We better tell them that there's pimps, there's Johns, there's all kinds of craziness happening out here. And you keep your little eyes open and you make them aware of what is going on. That's how these kids are getting caught up, a lot of them. But anyway, when the pimp turned her out, and so she, long story short, she ended up staying with him for till she was 27 years old. At the end, what he did was she tried to run away, she said 3 times. The last time she ran away, he got really upset with her because that's his money. Pimp doesn't like to lose his money. So what he did was he beat her up really bad, took her to an abandoned building, tied her up, and just kind of left her for dead. And what she said was the next day, an inspector, thank God, came by and was looking at all the buildings and found her hanging there. She stayed in the hospital here for 6 months. She said when she got out of the hospital, she didn't know where to go. She's 27, that's all she knows. But we got to think about that. We talk about rehabilitation. She didn't need rehabilitation, she needed to be rehabilitated. She never had anything. That's all she's been. And that is the story of many of the women, regardless of what you hear. Regardless of what you hear. She said finally she went by some church, and she talked to a pastor, and she was just hoping that he would hear her voice, and he did. He called the Office of Justice, and he got the number to Breaking Free, and he called us, and he asked could he send her to us, and that's how we got this young woman at 27 years old. But I'll tell you, when she came, one thing that I wanted to do just a little bit about Breaking Free. Breaking Free is the first program in the country that provides housing. We had transitional housing, and we had supportive housing. Transitional housing, a woman could stay for up to 2 years. Now I say most every woman that came through the program needed to go into transitional first, because I said she needed to be rehabilitated. See, a lot of them have never lived on their own because they've been in the life so long, they don't know where to begin. Okay, they don't know, how do I do this? I got 2 kids, this is new. But it's hard to look at that when you're, 25, 30 years old, and so we needed more transitional, but we had, could have about 10 women in our transitional. And then we got permanent housing, and we did that without any money from HUD. We did that with just a whole lot of, I'm going to say, prayers and creative thinking, because we needed it. The majority of the women that came through Breaking Free were homeless. And I said, we can't expect them to get their life together if they don't have anywhere to lay their head at night. I don't know if anyone ever here has even been near homeless. Had to stay with a parent or stay with a friend. It's not easy, is all I'm saying. So what we were able to do was to master lease an apartment building for it had 12 units in it. And then we got a call that HUD heard we were doing this, and it was almost like they were like, who do they think they are doing this without our money, without our help? So they asked, hey, can we come up and check your program out? We heard about it, and of course I'm like, yeah, come. So they came, and after that visit, we were able to add almost 20 more units for our women. So right now, Breaking Free has, I think it's about, I can't remember, about 20 units or so. But women have got to be able to have housing. Now, housing's not easy if she hasn't been rehabilitated, and that's for a whole lot of reasons. But I call the lady that I just told you, I call that Sarah's story. And one thing I want to tell you just a little bit about the statistics up in Minnesota. Minnesota, the population is less than 10% Black American. Oh, maybe 9.5% Black American. But Breaking Free works with at least, I'm going to say probably about almost 50% Black American women. And Tina kind of mentioned that. I won't talk a lot about it. But Black women fall through the cracks everywhere, okay? And prostitution is one of the big, huge places. Emma bought up that too. Sorry, catching her here. But Emma bought that up too. And one thing that I didn't hear that really needs to be said, that we did our own little research project some years back on the criminal justice system. And what we found out was that Black women were more likely to receive longer jail time than that of white women, higher fines, lose their children to child protection, lose their housing, unable to find jobs, than that of the white women that we worked with. I had a Black woman and a white woman who were both pulled over by the police in Minneapolis. And the police officer, they were walking the streets. He made them both get into his car, and he was going to intimidate them, and that's okay. The women are strong, but anyway, he gets these 2 women in his car, and he immediately tells the Black woman, get out of the car and go back to doing what you do. And she didn't think about what he was saying, but of course she jumped out of the car because she didn't want to go to jail, he told the white woman, he said, she asked him, well, why can't I go? You just let her go, why are you not letting me go? He said, because you should know better. You should know better. He said, I can't see the number, I'm sorry. 1 minute. Oh, 1 minute, okay. And so he said, you should know better because of the fact that you're white and you've got more opportunity. You can do anything you want to do. You know what I mean? And it went deeper than that. But this is the mentality of how racism works in prostitution. This is the mentality. I was going to say some other things. But just to end it, because I don't have much time, who should be held accountable? Should the victims? Should the woman? Regardless if she started at 13 or 30. You need to think about that deeply because I believe that that's going to be something that we are all going to see on the ballot. It's, going as we move forward. What do you think about this? Do you think prostitution you should be out talking about it, telling people, I'm telling you, where do we want to be in this country? We always hear, let's make America beautiful, or whatever that saying is, I don't know. Great again. Okay. Would that be making America great, for one thing? What will that say? Do you think our children are going to be sheltered if it's legalized here? They're already getting involved, and we're not even, no. We have to think about a lot of things right now because this is a serious question. And I don't know that I'll be here to see it, but I believe something is going to go down here within the next 5 years regarding prostitution in our country. And there's a lot of issues we've already got here in this country. We know that. We want that one too. We have to think about it. Thank you.
All of you left us with a lot to think about. So we'll just take a few questions from the audience. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
There's a lot of state legislation, Vermont, New York, California, to try to legalize prostitution, owning brothels and the whole thing. We had a big fight here in DC, and I think it's going to come back again. But any ideas on what's the best way to communicate this to legislators? This is just a horrific idea, and because it gets pushed from other groups saying, it's survival sex and they should have the right to do it, and you're preventing their rights, and it just gets really upside down.
Well, I can say, because we did the big fight here in DC. We have a youth policy group at Courtney's house. Their ages range from 13 to about 18 years old. So they met with a lot of the DC Council here. And I'm just going to say one of our youth who was 15, asked one of the women who is African American council member, if your daughter who's 18 and this is a job and she chose to do this, what would you be okay with that? Of course, she tried to skirt around it. Oh, she's 18, her position, right. But she didn't exactly answer. And I think that's really important, having their voice in the reality. And the other thing is this. When people are talking, I know the people on the pro side. And when they're talking, you have to pay attention to details. The details are, people are saying, well, I started when I was 13. I'm 28. I've been doing it this long. This is what I want. But the key was they started at 13. Everybody started when you hear them as a minor. That's trafficking. It was grown men buying sex from kids. And so what Benita was saying, when you're in the life, like I didn't know. I was in life since I was 9 years old. And I didn't know. I knew something bad was happening to me. But I didn't know these words that people were saying. So when I was 15 and 16, said, this is my choice. This is what I want to do. So I think you have to understand, that's because they're not killed. always spoke more to them and talked to them about the abuse when they were younger. And I think it's better to go that route because then they start thinking a lot. And the last thing I would say, transgender population between the ages of 30 to 55 were actually on Courtney's house side and not legalized. The younger population didn't read Bill. And the older population did and knew no services was attached. So that would be the other thing. If the people care for you so much that are pushing to legalize this, why aren't services attached to it? Anybody want to add to it?
I think drawing from our experience in France, because we also brought the subject to politicians and the equality model, and we wanted to sensitize them and we wanted to obtain this law, which we obtained. And what happened is that civil society kind of built a huge coalition. So there were many grassroots organizations working with prostitutes persons, but not only, there were like faith-based organizations, Marxist organizations, just like a bunch of people coming together working on different topics, but that were that were sharing the abolitionist fight. And so this coalition was named Abolition 2012, and basically it put a lot of pressure on the government. So this was like a very big feminist movement that brought these subjects to light. Not only like we campaigned on several aspects, so there was first like media bringing the subject to the attention of the public, and all the organizations that were a part of this coalition had to, whenever interviewed, speak about the equality model and why it was important. So there was this, but there was also like kind of quiet lobbying and going to politicians, identifying champions that were ready to carry the voices of survivors within the parliament. And that's what we basically managed to obtain, little meetings with survivors, because they need to be at the forefront of this fight for the equality model. We need to center all of our speech, all of our experience around their experience. And so that's what happened. And it took a long time, I'm not gonna lie, probably like 5 years. So if there are some initiatives that fail, it's okay. We just need to try again, and eventually it'll work. And it happened in France. I don't know if you want to complete it.
Just to add on it, and that's also the point of the last first report, and the message we are trying to spread here. There is this issue of the ideological or cultural battle over prostitution, and the states you mentioned. I think it's not a coincidence if these states are very progressist, kind of, right? So I think it's important to reframe the debate according to our terms, because again, I mean, the feeling we've had in the last weeks is that this fakely progressist narrative on sex work is work, my body, my choice, etc., as if my body, my choice had anything in common with prostitution.
Yeah.
We see the harm it makes on abolitionists who are actually, as we explained, as you know, on very progressist, actually. So I think it's important when we carry out this message to really not to react to what they are trying to do, but to foster, to create our own narrative, to create our terms of the debate, and to really feed the parliamentarians and the civil society and the public opinion with this progressist narrative, which is the abolitionist narrative. So it's just the message we have been trying to spread all over the country, to be honest.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Do you have any questions from the audience that's online that needs to be answered?
There are so many questions, but
Yeah. Well, while
I've
you're
been writing and pointing them to your website and to the report. But I think, we've got some food.
Okay. So let's just take one more from the audience. Yes, ma'am. And then we'll just have one person from the area.
Mine is for Jonathan. So earlier in your talk you mentioned the use of the term sex work equating to work is not helpful in discourse. So what terms other than prostitution, what does it denote? Like what other terms other than prostitution denote things that are not helpful?
But so I have a question. Why not using the term prostitution?
Well,
Why not using the term prostitution?
She's not
I'm not
No, I know, but that's the thing. For us, there is no real other word that we use, to be honest. What we know is the concept of sex work is itself what we would, I don't know if we call it like this in English, but a combat term. Like, it's a term created to foster a narrative and to change, to foster a certain argument. It's not a natural term, and we completely understand, and I completely understand it as everyone. Before educating myself on the issue of prostitution, I could have used the term sex work just to be polite, just because I heard that it would be less stigmatizing or more polite, maybe, I don't know, more or less offensive. But if sex work is work, I mean, what we say is that sex work is neither sex nor work, actually. Because if it's sex, I mean, it's not the sexuality we want. If it's work, then it should be legalized, because why not legalizing work, right? So if we consider that it is a violence, we cannot use the term sex work, because work cannot be as and of itself a form of violence. If it was, it would not match the legally speaking, the standards of the International Labour Organization, for instance. Work cannot be violence as and of itself. So I don't know if it answers your question, but we understand that after years or decades of kind of propaganda against, I mean, trying to erase the word prostitution, it has become complicated to use it. But I think it's part of the battle we have to carry out, because to us, that's the only word that defines what it is. And just one thing, that's part of the debate we've had about the vocabulary. Should we talk about prostitution or about trafficking? Should we talk about victims? Should we use this word? I think, and we think it's very important to use this word, because if prostitution is violence and we cannot talk about victims, it means that it would be the only form of violence which is victimless. It doesn't work. And if prostitution is sex work, then why try to abolish some kind of work? Right? So again, let's try to reframe the debate according to our terms. And there is a huge fight on the vocabulary in the US, but also at the UN level, for instance.
Thank you so much, and I really want to thank all of you for all of the work that you're doing in this area. Can we give them a hand? So with that, John, I'm going to ask you to come up so that we can take pictures. The rest of you, there's food outside, and the speakers will be joining you after pictures. So if you have more questions to ask, they will be available. Thank you guys so very much. John.